On a night that was supposed to celebrate his triumph as the new chairman of Harrison Industries, mogul Robert Harrison prepares to speak before New York's elite in the luxurious grand ballroom of the Marriott. At 58 years old, he had built a billion-dollar empire and would finally achieve the recognition he had always sought. But when three unknown young people burst into the hall during his moment of glory, they bring with them photographs that will reveal a devastating secret buried for 25 years. Amid tears and accusations, they shout the words that will make Robert's world crumble. "You are our father." In front of hundreds of shocked witnesses and cameras documenting every second, Robert will be forced to confront the consequences of choices he made decades ago when he abandoned a young pregnant employee. Now, a DNA test will determine not only the scientific truth but whether a man who built his life on power and control can find the courage to become the father he never was.
Hello. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. At the end, please rate the story. I will be happy to respond to you in the comments. Now, let's get to the story.
The grand ballroom of the Marriott Hotel in Manhattan sparkled that night like a precious jewel in the heart of New York. Crystal chandeliers hung majestically from the ornate ceiling, each facet capturing and reflecting the golden light that bathed the hall in an almost ethereal glow. The atmosphere pulsed with a tangible energy, the kind of energy that only emanates when power, money, and influence converge in the same space. Hundreds of guests occupied the circular tables covered with immaculate white linen, each place carefully arranged with crystals that sparkled like diamonds under the soft lighting. The murmur of conversations blended with the delicate clinking of cutlery against fine china, creating a discreet symphony of elegance and sophistication. Robert Harrison, at 58 years old, moved across the stage with the confidence of a man who had conquered the world. His black tuxedo was impeccable, every line tailored to enhance his imposing figure. His gray hair, styled with precision, framed a face that radiated determination and success. But it was his blue eyes that truly commanded attention. Clear as the winter sky, they shone with the intensity of decades of business victories, each successful negotiation, each empire built, reflecting in that piercing gaze. The applause echoed through the hall like a rising wave of approval. Gloved hands met in a rhythmic cadence, while smiling faces turned toward the stage. Robert felt the warmth of admiration rising from the audience, warming his chest with a deep and familiar satisfaction. It was the recognition for years of dedication, sleepless nights, and calculated risks that had brought him to this point. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, a nearly imperceptible gesture that revealed his attention to detail. The weight of the responsibility he was about to assume as chairman of the board of Harrison Industries rested on his shoulders, but not as a burden, like a crown finally finding its place on the king's head. The lights in the hall seemed to converge on him as he approached the podium. The microphone awaited, black and silent, ready to amplify the words that would define not only his tenure but the future of one of the largest industrial conglomerates in the country. Robert felt his heart quicken slightly, not from nervousness, but from an almost youthful anticipation. At 58, he still felt that same excitement from his early days as an entrepreneur, when every opportunity represented a chance to prove his worth. His fingers closed around the microphone, the cold metal contrasting with the warmth of his hands. The hall began to quiet down, an expectant silence taking over the atmosphere. Robert slightly lifted his chin, his blue eyes scanning the sea of faces watching him intently. This was the moment he had waited for his entire life. The microphone vibrated slightly in his hands as he prepared to speak, the words already formed in his mind, ready to be unleashed in that historic moment that would definitively seal his legacy. At the moment Robert was preparing to utter his first words, the double mahogany doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a bang that sliced through the reverent silence like a blade. The echo of the impact reverberated off the silk-lined walls, causing some guests at the nearest tables to jump in their seats. Three young people appeared at the entrance, their silhouettes outlined against the golden light of the hallway. Two men and a woman, all appearing to be in their mid-20s, violently contrasted with the atmosphere of opulence surrounding them. Their clothes were simple faded jeans, basic t-shirts, and worn sneakers, as if they had stepped directly from the streets of Manhattan into that sanctuary of luxury. The first man, tall and thin, with unkempt brown hair, was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling at an accelerated pace. His dark eyes scanned the ballroom with an intensity that bordered on desperation. The woman beside him, with blonde hair tied in a messy ponytail, had trembling hands and a face as pale as marble. The third young man, shorter and stockier, clenched his fists at his sides, his jaw set in a determination that seemed fueled by deep pain. The three began to cross the ballroom with firm steps, each footfall echoing on the marble floor like drumbeats. The murmur of the crowd transformed into a growing buzz of confusion and alarm. Conversations abruptly ceased, replaced by urgent whispers and the soft sound of chairs being dragged as guests turned to observe the surreal scene unfolding before them. The security guards, uniformed and until then practically invisible in the strategic corners of the room, were caught off guard. Two of them quickly moved toward the young people, their hands instinctively reaching for the radios clipped to their belts. But there was something in the determination of those three young people that made them hesitate. They did not emanate violence, but rather a desperate urgency that seemed to transcend any security protocol. "Sir, please stop where you are," one of the security guards attempted, extending his hand in a gesture meant to be firm but sounding almost pleading. The young people didn't even glance at him, continuing their inexorable march through the maze of tables. Women in long dresses and sparkling jewelry recoiled from their chairs, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and alarm. Men in tuxedos furrowed their brows, some rising slightly from their seats as if prepared to protect their companions. Robert, still on stage, felt the confident smile fade from his lips. His eyebrows knitted together in a growing expression of dismay, and he lowered the microphone, the metal now feeling heavy in his hand. His blue eyes, moments before shining with triumph, now followed every movement of the three young people with an unease he could not disguise. The atmosphere of the ballroom had transformed completely. What had once been a golden celebration of success and power now pulsed with palpable tension. The air felt denser, charged with expectation and an indefinable foreboding. The crystal chandeliers continued to shine, but their light now seemed colder, casting dancing shadows that moved nervously across the walls. The three young people finally reached the foot of the stage, their steps ceasing in unison. The silence that followed was deafening, even breaths seemed suspended in anticipation. It was then that Robert could see their faces clearly, and what he saw made him swallow hard. Tears glistened in the eyes of the three young people as they lifted their faces to him. They were not tears of anger or hatred, but something much deeper and more disturbing. They were tears of a pain that seemed as ancient as it was profound, tears that carried the weight of untold stories and unspoken truths. The tall man trembled slightly, his lips moving as if trying to find words. The blonde woman pressed her hand against her chest, as if trying to contain something that threatened to explode. The third young man simply looked at Robert with an intensity that seemed to pierce his soul. Robert felt a chill run down his spine, his fingers contracting around the microphone. In that moment, suspended between the past and the future, he had no idea that his life was about to change forever. The voice that echoed through the grand ballroom was not one, but three, intertwined in a devastating harmony that cut through the air like a war cry. The words sprang from the trembling lips of the young people with a force that seemed to arise from the depths of their souls. "You are our father!" The shout reverberated off the silk-lined walls, ricocheting against the crystal chandeliers that flickered subtly with the intensity of the sound. For a moment that felt like an eternity, time crystallized in the hall. It was as if someone had muted the sound of the world, leaving only the echo of those four words hanging in the air like a final sentence. The silence that followed was more deafening than any noise. 500 pairs of eyes instantly fixed on the imposing figure of Robert Harrison, whose face, moments before radiating confidence, was now transforming into a mask of pure shock. The color drained from his cheeks as if it had been siphoned away, leaving a ghostly pallor that contrasted brutally with his blue eyes, now wide with horror. His hands tightened around the microphone with a force that made the knuckles turn white. The metal seemed to be the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly lost all stability. Robert felt his legs tremble imperceptibly, and for a terrifying moment, he feared they might give way under the weight of the revelation. The crowd remained petrified, as if they were marble statues adorning a mausoleum. Mouths opened in expressions of silent astonishment. Champagne flutes remained suspended in the air, forgotten in the hands of their holders. The very air seemed to have become denser, charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. Then, as if someone had broken a spell, the murmuring began. First came discreet whispers, voices muffled by gloved hands. "Did you hear that? Those young people," they said. "Could it be true?" The murmur grew like a wave, spreading from table to table. Some guests leaned to the sides, urgently whispering in their neighbors' ears. Others remained in absolute silence, their faces reflecting a mix of morbid fascination and deep discomfort. The digital age did not spare even that sacred moment. The bluish glow of cell phone screens began to emerge like fireflies through the crowd. Discreet clicks of cameras mingled with the whispers, as some guests, driven by an almost primal instinct, began to document what could be one of the biggest social scandals of the decade. A woman in a navy blue dress, sitting in the third row, held her phone with trembling hands, the flash reflecting off her pearls. A gray-haired man, clearly a media mogul, typed furiously, his fingers flying over the screen while his eyes remained fixed on the stage. David Miller, the event organizer, a middle-aged man with gold-rimmed glasses and a pristine gray suit, had risen from his table in the front row. His professional instincts propelled him forward, his determined steps toward the three young people who continued to stand at the foot of the stage like sentinels of an unwanted truth. "Please, you need to leave," David began, his voice trying to sound authoritative but failing to hide the underlying tremor. "This is a private event, and you are not authorized to." But his words died in his throat when his eyes met those of the three young people. There was something in the intensity of their pain, in the authenticity of their tears, that made him stop in his tracks. The tall man continued to tremble, his hands open at his sides as if pleading for understanding. The blonde woman had pressed both hands against her chest, her sobs now audible amid the controlled chaos of the hall. The third young man remained motionless, his tears tracing silent paths down his cheeks while his eyes never left Robert. David Miller felt his legs falter. It was not just the emotional intensity of the situation, it was the resemblance. Now that he looked closer, he could see features on the tall man's face that echoed Robert's aristocratic traits. The shape of the blonde woman's nose, the shape of the third young man's eyes, small details that, together, formed a disturbing mosaic. Robert, on stage, felt the world spin slightly around him. His decades of experience in tough negotiations, his crisis management skills, all seemed to evaporate in the face of that moment. But something deep in his survivor's nature began to manifest. He straightened up, his shoulders broadening, and raised the microphone with a determination that seemed to arise from despair. "This is complete nonsense." His voice cut through the murmur like a sharp blade, amplified by the sound system that made his words echo in every corner of the hall. "I do not know these people." The words came out with controlled authority, but anyone paying attention could detect the almost imperceptible tremor in his voice, the forced rigidity of his gestures. Robert Harrison, the master of business, the man who had faced congressmen and multinational CEOs, was clearly shaken to the core. The hall erupted into controlled chaos. Voices rose in volume, some expressing indignation, others wild speculation. Camera flashes blinked like lightning, as journalists disguised among the guests began to stir, their professional instincts awakening like predators scenting blood. The tension in the air was so thick it felt about to materialize. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would change not only Robert Harrison's life but potentially the business and social landscape of New York. The grand ballroom, which moments before had been a temple of celebration and success, now pulsed with a dangerous energy, as if the very walls were about to explode under the pressure of the moment. Robert gripped the microphone with renewed strength, his blue eyes now shining not with confidence, but with a fierce determination to survive. Meanwhile, the three young people remained motionless, their tears continuing to flow, their presence a silent accusation that no words could erase. The young woman stepped forward, slightly separating herself from her companions. Her brown hair, which had partially come loose from the ponytail during the nervous walk through the hall, framed a face that, now under the golden lights of the stage, revealed a fragile yet determined beauty. Her green eyes, shining with unshed tears, fixed on Robert with an intensity that seemed to pierce his soul. "You knew our mother, Sarah Mitchell!" Her voice echoed through the hall with a strength that contrasted with her delicate appearance. Each word was pronounced with a crystal-clear clarity that cut through the murmur of the crowd like a sharp blade. Her trembling hands dove into the pocket of her faded denim jacket, and when they emerged, they carried a small, time-yellowed envelope. With deliberate movements, she pulled out several old photographs, their edges slightly worn from frequent handling. She held them above her head, as if they were sacred evidence in a divine court. "These are the proofs." Her voice broke into a sob, but she continued, "You cannot deny that you knew her." The effect on Robert was instant and devastating. His body, which moments before had maintained an upright and defensive posture, seemed to freeze completely. It was as if someone had poured liquid ice into his veins. His blue eyes, which had been nervously darting around the crowd, fixed on the photographs with an expression of absolute horror. Even from a distance, through the stage lights and the fog of tension hanging in the air, Robert could distinguish the damning images. His face, decades younger but unmistakably the same, smiled back at him through time. The photographs trembled slightly in the young woman's hands, but they were clear enough for the entire crowd to see fragments of a secret life that had been buried for 25 years. In the first image, a stunning blonde woman sat next to Robert in an elegant restaurant. Their hands touched over the table, while half-filled wine glasses reflected candlelight. The intimacy captured in that moment was undeniable. It was not the formal cordiality of a business meeting, but the tender affection of lovers. Another photograph showed the two walking along the winding paths of Central Park during what appeared to be an autumn Sunday. Sarah, a name that now echoed in the minds of everyone present, wore a yellow sweater that perfectly complemented her golden hair. Her head was tilted toward Robert's shoulder, which he embraced with a possessive protection that spoke of deep intimacy. But it was the third photograph that made the entire hall collectively hold its breath. Sarah appeared with a visibly pregnant belly, her hands lovingly cradling the rounded abdomen. She smiled radiantly at the camera, but her eyes were fixed on Robert, who stood beside her with a smile that mixed pride and happiness. The photo had been taken in a garden that many recognized as the private gardens of the Harrison Mansion in Long Island. The crowd leaned forward as a single entity, necks stretching, bodies shifting in their chairs in a desperate attempt to see better, the images revealing a long-buried truth. The previous murmur transformed into a more urgent whisper, voices rising in speculation and astonishment. "My God, it really is him! That woman, she is so young! Did you see the pregnancy photo?" Robert felt his legs tremble violently. His face, which had regained some color during his earlier denial, was now paler than marble. His hands, still gripping the microphone, trembled visibly. When he finally managed to speak, his voice came out as an amplified whisper carrying the weight of decades of secrets. That was a long time ago." The words came out haltingly, broken by the emotion he could no longer control. "She was just an employee." The lie sounded pathetic even to his own ears. Everyone in the hall could see that the photographs told a very different story. There was nothing. Just an employee. In the way he looked at Sarah, in the way their bodies leaned toward each other, in the genuine happiness radiating from their young faces. His voice betrayed not only nervousness but something much deeper and more disturbing, guilt. It was the voice of a man who had been confronted with the ghosts of his past, ghosts that materialized in the form of three young people whose eyes carried the same intensity he recognized in Sarah. The organizer, David Miller, still standing between the young people and the stage, felt his legs wobble. He had worked with Robert Harrison for years, organizing events, managing his public image, but he had never imagined that such deep and devastating secrets lay hidden beneath the polished facade of the magnate. The other two young people, who had remained silent, now moved closer to their companion. The tall man placed a protective hand on her shoulder, while the stockier one clenched his fists, his eyes shining with a rage that seemed fueled by years of abandonment and denial. The grand ballroom, which moments before had been a temple of celebration, now pulsed with a dangerous energy. Reality was forming in the minds of everyone present like an image slowly emerging from a photographic solution. The pieces of the puzzle fit together with a cruel precision, the physical resemblance between Robert and the young people, the photographs revealing an intimate relationship with Sarah Mitchell, the pregnancy, and now 3 young people of about 25 years old claiming paternity. The cameras continued to flash, immortalizing every moment of this drama unfolding like a Greek tragedy. Robert Harrison, the man who had built an empire based on control and precision, was now being publicly dismantled, brick, by truths he had tried to bury forever. Michael stepped forward, his imposing stature standing out even more under the dramatic lights of the hall. His dark hair, styled with a care that contrasted with his simple clothes, framed a face that bore unmistakably familiar features. But it was his blue eyes, exactly the same glacial shade as Robert Harrison's, that sent a wave of recognition rippling through the crowd like a collective shiver. When he spoke, his voice emerged deep and controlled, yet laden with a pain that had been fed by decades of silence. "Our mother, Sarah Mitchell, worked for your company for 3 years." Each word was pronounced with deliberate precision, as if he had rehearsed this phrase thousands of times in his mind. "You had a secret relationship, and when she became pregnant with triplets..." His voice faltered for a moment, the emotion threatening to break his composure. "You fired her and disappeared from her life." The impact of his words was like a silent explosion. The crowd reacted with a series of audible gasps that echoed through the hall like waves crashing against cliffs. Women brought their hands to their lips in shock, their eyes widening in horror. Men leaned back in their chairs as if the words were physically repulsive. "My God!" whispered a woman in a red dress in the second row, her voice trembling with indignation. "Triplets!" murmured another guest, the cruel math of the situation forming in his mind. "He abandoned a pregnant employee." The murmurs spread through the crowd like fire and dry straw, voices rising in moral outrage. Emma, the young woman with brown hair and green eyes, felt the tears she had been holding back finally spill over. They traced shining trails down her cheeks as she moved closer to the stage, her words coming out choked with sobs. "She died 2 years ago of cancer." Her voice broke completely, but she forced the words to keep coming. "Working 3 jobs to support us, always hoping you would come back." The revelation hit the hall like a hammer. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It was not one of shock or surprise, but of collective mourning. 500 hearts seemed to stop simultaneously, processing the tragedy of a woman who had died waiting for the man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. An elderly lady in the front row pressed a lace handkerchief to her eyes, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Even some of the hardest men in the business world felt their throats tighten, confronted with a raw humanity that rarely penetrated their protected worlds. James, the third young man, had remained silent until now, but something in the mention of his mother's death made him find his voice. He was sturdier than his brothers, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical labor, but his eyes carried the same deep pain that marked the other two. "She never spoke ill of you." His voice came out hoarse, laden with an emotion that had been suppressed for too long. "She always said that maybe one day you would recognize that you had 3 children." James's words cut deeper than any accusation could have. They painted the portrait of a woman who had kept faith in a man who did not deserve even a fraction of her loyalty, who had died believing that the father of her children would eventually do the right thing. Robert, on stage, seemed to visibly shrink. His shoulders, which moments before had been erect in defiance, now slumped under the weight of the truth. His hands trembled so violently around the microphone that the metal seemed to vibrate, creating a low, disturbing feedback through the sound system. His face had undergone a complete transformation. The color had drained completely, leaving him with a cadaverous pallor that made his features appear hollow. His blue eyes, which had been his trademark in negotiations and presentations, now looked like broken glass, reflecting a shattered soul. He opened his mouth several times, trying to form words, but each attempt resulted only in air being expelled soundlessly. It was as if his voice had been physically ripped from his throat by the magnitude of what was being revealed. The crowd watched in fascinated silence, witnessing the destruction of a man who had been considered untouchable. Every person present could see that Robert Harrison was not only being confronted with his denied paternity, but with the devastating consequences of his actions, or lack thereof. Camera flashes continued to flicker intermittently, each click documenting a moment that would be dissected and analyzed by media, courts, and history. The undercover journalist in the third row typed furiously on his phone, his hands barely keeping up with the speed of the events unfolding. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom had become dense and suffocating. The air felt charged with emotional electricity, as if a storm was about to erupt. Some guests had leaned forward in their chairs, as if they could somehow absorb the magnitude of the drama unfolding. David Miller, the organizer, remained paralyzed between the young men and the stage, his hands nervously opening and closing. He could feel the weight of 500 pairs of eyes alternating between the young men revealing their painful truth and the man on stage who was being systematically destroyed by it. The microphone squeaked slightly as Robert finally managed to form words. His voice, when it finally emerged, was unrecognizable, broken, fragile, as if it were being forced through crushed glass. I didn't know about the... The words died again, swallowed by the emotion he could no longer control. Robert swallowed hard, his throat producing an audible sound that was picked up by the microphone. His hands continued to tremble as he tried to find the words that could somehow rebuild the walls that had crumbled around him. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged weak and wavering, a pathetic shadow of the confident man who had stepped onto the stage just minutes before. I can't be responsible for all the allegations. The words came out haltingly, each one seeming to cause him physical pain. He paused, taking a deep breath, trying to gather the fragments of his composure. There are many people who can make these claims. His defense sounded hollow even to his own ears. The crowd could see through the desperate transparency of his words, and many shook their heads in disgust. It was the response of a cornered man, not that of someone truly innocent. Michael did not allow Robert to finish his pathetic stammering. He stepped forward, his blue eyes, perfect mirrors of Robert's, shining with a steely determination that starkly contrasted with the weakness emanating from the stage. Then take a DNA test. His voice cut through the air like an axe, clear and challenging. Prove that we are your children. The suggestion hit the hall like an electric shock. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, erupted into a chaos of murmurs, exclamations, and shouts of support. Voices rose from all directions. That's right! Take the test! Prove your innocence! A journalist in the fifth row, who had been discreetly recording everything on his phone, could no longer contain his professional instinct. He stood up from his chair, his voice cutting through the tumult. Take the test, Mr. Harrison! The American public deserves to know the truth. His statement was met with a wave of applause and shouts of agreement. Other journalists present, realizing that the disguise had been broken, began to stand up as well, their cameras and phones pointed directly at the stage. David Miller, who had been watching the chaos unfold with growing horror, finally reacted. His footsteps echoed across the stage floor as he rushed toward Robert, his face flushed with anxiety and panic. He approached the microphone, his hands outstretched in a gesture of peace. Please, let's all calm down. His voice came out loud and nervous through the sound system. This is a very delicate situation and... Robert interrupted him with a brusque and irritated gesture, pushing him away with his arm. The movement was captured by dozens of cameras, and David stumbled slightly, his eyes widening in surprise and humiliation. It was clear that Robert wanted no interference. He had decided to face this situation alone, no matter how disastrous it might be. The pressure in the hall was palpable, as if the air had become dense and hard to breathe. Hundreds of cell phones were now pointed directly at the stage, their screens glowing like tiny stars in the dimness of the hall. Each pixel was capturing the real-time destruction of one of the most powerful men in America. Robert could feel the weight of all those eyes, all those cameras, all that expectation. His reputation, built over decades of hard work and careful negotiations, was literally crumbling before his eyes. He could practically hear his company's stock plummeting, contracts being cancelled, partnerships being dissolved. But more than that, he could see the future unfolding before him like a horror movie. The newspaper headlines, the investigations, the lawsuits, the endless questions from reporters. There was no turning back from this moment. His life had been permanently divided into before and after this night. His eyes moved from the young people at the front of the stage to the expectant crowd, and finally to the cameras documenting every micro-expression on his face. He realized there was no way out. Denying it would only prolong the suffering and make him seem even more guilty. With tremendous effort, he raised the microphone again. His voice, when it finally emerged, was laden with a bitter resignation that echoed through the hall like a funeral bell. Very well. The words came out like a defeated sigh. If this is going to end this embarrassment. He paused, swallowing again, his Adam's apple visibly moving. I agree to take the test. The audience's reaction was instantaneous and cacophonous. Some began to applaud, the sound echoing through the hall like rain on a metal roof. Others let out audible sighs of relief, as if they had been holding their breath for hours. Many continued filming, their cameras capturing not just the words, but the defeated body language of a man who had just signed his own social death sentence. Finally! Shouted a woman from the third row. About time! Added another voice. Justice! Echoed from somewhere in the back of the hall. The three young people exchanged glances, their expressions mixing relief, validation, and deep sadness. Emma wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand, while James put a protective arm around Michael's shoulders. They had achieved what they came for, not just recognition, but a path to the truth. The security personnel, who had been watching the situation with growing concern, finally received a signal from David Miller. They moved through the crowd with professional efficiency, their black uniforms standing out against the colorful attire of the guests. They formed a discreet yet effective circle around the three young people, creating a physical barrier between them and the increasingly agitated crowd. The atmosphere in the hall had completely changed. What had started as a celebration had transformed into a public trial, and now it was evolving into something even more intense, a historic moment being documented by hundreds of witnesses. Robert took a deep breath, his ribs visibly expanding under his immaculate tuxedo. He looked directly at Michael, Emma, and James, his eyes meeting theirs for the first time since they had stepped onto the stage. In that moment, he could see not only Sarah reflected in their faces but also himself, a realization that hit him like a punch to the stomach. Raising the microphone once more, his voice came out clearer, though still trembling. The test will be done immediately. 3 hours had passed since Robert Harrison had agreed to take the DNA test, and the grand ballroom seemed to have transformed into an improvised courtroom. Most of the guests had remained, as if they were witnesses to a historic moment they could not simply abandon. The waiters had discreetly served coffee and water, creating a surreal atmosphere where high society awaited the verdict that could destroy one of its most prominent members. The lights in the hall had been slightly dimmed, creating a twilight that made the wait even more dramatic. Low conversations echoed through the space, like the buzzing of nervous bees. Cell phones continued to flash intermittently, documenting every second of this collective vigil. Robert was sitting in a chair that had been brought in especially for him at the center of the stage. His posture was completely different from the confident man who had stepped up there hours earlier. His shoulders were hunched, as if they carried the weight of the world, and his hands trembled slightly on his thighs. The impeccable tuxedo now looked wrinkled, and his perfectly styled hair was disheveled where he had nervously run his hands through it. His eyes, which had been his trademark in negotiations, now looked like frosted glass, lost in a sea of regret and anxiety. He shifted restlessly in the chair, crossing and uncrossing his legs, adjusting his tie, anything to relieve the tension that consumed his body like acid. In the front row, the three young people sat side by side, their chairs positioned to face the stage. Michael, Emma, and James were holding hands, forming a human chain of mutual support. Their fingers intertwined tightly, as if they were castaways clinging to each other in a storm. Emma had stopped crying, but her eyes remained red and swollen. She rested her head on Michael's shoulder, finding comfort in the presence of her brothers. James, on the other side, squeezed Michael's hand with an intensity that made his knuckles turn white. The main door of the hall opened with a soft metallic sound, and all heads turned in unison. Dr. Patricia Wilson entered with measured and professional steps, her presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone present. She was a middle-aged woman, with gray hair neatly tied in a bun and thin-rimmed glasses that lent authority to her serious face. She wore a dark suit and carried a brown leather briefcase, but it was the sealed envelope in her right hand that captured all gazes. The white envelope seemed to glow under the hall's lights, as if it contained not just scientific results, but the fate of several lives. Her footsteps echoed in the absolute silence as she walked toward the stage. Each sound of her heels against the marble floor seemed amplified, creating a hypnotic rhythm that made the hearts of those present beat in the same tempo. David Miller, who had been anxiously waiting near the stage, approached her with a mixed expression of relief and terror. They exchanged a few words in low voices, and she nodded, indicating that she was ready to make the announcement. Dr. Wilson stepped onto the stage with the confidence of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. Her hands did not tremble, her breathing was controlled, and her expression remained professionally neutral, even in the face of the moment's magnitude. She positioned herself next to the microphone, adjusting its height with precise movements. The momentary feedback from the sound system made some people flinch, but she patiently waited until the equipment was functioning perfectly. "Good evening." Her voice emerged clear and authoritative through the sound system, cutting through the tense silence like a blade. "I am Dr. Patricia Wilson, a forensic genetics specialist from GeneTech Laboratory. I was called here tonight to conduct an emergency paternity test." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd before settling first on the three young people in the front row, and then on Robert on stage. Their expressions remained professional, but there was a human softness in her eyes that suggested she understood the emotional weight of the moment. "The results of the DNA test," she continued, her voice maintaining the same clear and authoritative tone, "confirm with 99.9% certainty that Robert Harrison is the biological father of Michael, Emma, and James Mitchell." The words hung in the air for a moment, as if the universe had paused to process their magnitude. Then, like a dam breaking, reality hit the hall in successive waves. The silence was broken by collective gasps that echoed like a chorus of surprise, although many present already knew deep down what the result would be. Murmurs erupted throughout the hall, voices rising in tones of shock, validation, and indignation. "I knew it!" whispered a woman in a blue dress. "My God, those poor boys!" murmured another guest. "How could he abandon them like that?" The question echoed from various directions simultaneously. Robert, upon hearing the final words, closed his eyes tightly, as if he could somehow block out the reality that had just been scientifically confirmed. His head bowed down, chin almost touching his chest, and his shoulders trembled slightly. It was the posture of a completely defeated man, someone who had lost not just a battle, but the entire war. His hands, which had been restless on his thighs, now clenched into tight fists. He could feel the eyes of 500 people on him, judging him, condemning him, documenting his humiliation for posterity. The three young people in the front row reacted as if an unbearable pressure had suddenly been released from their bodies. Michael was the first to move, letting go of his siblings' hands and turning to embrace them. Emma broke down in sobs, but now they were tears of relief and validation, not of pain and despair. "We did it," she whispered through her tears, her voice muffled by Michael's shoulder. "Mommy, we did it." James, the most robust of the three, allowed his own tears to flow freely for the first time that night. He wrapped his arms around his siblings, creating a collective hug that seemed to celebrate a victory while mourning a loss. The audience was visibly divided in their reactions. Some guests had tears in their eyes, moved by the desperate journey of the young people seeking recognition. Others looked at Robert with a mix of disdain and pity, struggling to reconcile the man they had respected with the father who had abandoned three children. Cameras continued to flash, but now with less frenzy and more solemnity. It was as if everyone understood they were witnessing not just the resolution of a dispute, but a moment that would define Robert Harrison's legacy forever. Dr. Wilson remained on stage for a few more moments, observing the reactions with the silent compassion of someone who had delivered countless life-changing results. She carefully folded the envelope and placed it in her briefcase, her mission accomplished. Robert, still sitting in his chair, seemed to be struggling against invisible forces. His muscles tensed and relaxed repeatedly, as if he were preparing to stand but could not find the necessary strength. Finally, with a visible effort that made his face contort, he began to rise slowly from the chair. His movements were those of a much older man, every muscle protesting against the weight of the truth he now carried. His legs trembled slightly as he straightened up completely, facing for the first time the full reality of his fatherhood. The process of Robert getting up from the chair seemed to happen in slow motion, each movement laden with a weight that transcended the merely physical. His legs trembled as he shifted his weight to his feet, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed he might collapse back into the chair. But something deep within him, perhaps residual dignity, perhaps responsibility, finally awakened, propelled him upward. His face, which for decades had been a mask of confidence and control, now openly displayed defeat. The lines around his eyes seemed to have deepened in a matter of hours, and his skin had a sickly pallor that starkly contrasted with the healthy tan he had displayed earlier in the evening. It was as if he had aged a decade in a matter of minutes. Each step toward the edge of the stage echoed through the absolute silence of the hall. His Italian leather shoes, which had tread on red carpets and power offices around the world, now produced a hollow sound against the stage floor, as if they were walking over a coffin. When he reached the microphone stand, his hands trembled visibly. He extended his fingers, the same hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts, and carefully removed the microphone from the stand. The cold metal against his palm felt like the only real thing in a world that had become surreal. Robert raised the microphone close to his lips, and when he spoke, his voice emerged as an amplified whisper that reached every corner of the hall. There was no longer the commanding authority, no longer the confidence that had built an empire. There was only a broken man facing the truth. I apologize. The words hung in the air like smoke, simple yet devastating in their sincerity. They were not the calculated apologies of a CEO at a press conference, but the raw admission of someone who had failed in the most fundamental way possible. He carefully placed the microphone back on the stand, the final gesture of a man abandoning not just a stage, but a whole life of pretense and power. Then, in a movement that would be remembered by all present for the rest of their lives, Robert Harrison began to descend the steps of the stage. Each step was an abdication. Each step down took him further from the elevated position he had occupied for so long and closer to the level of common humanity he had tried to transcend. His fingers clutched the handrail as if it were an anchor, his knuckles white with the strength of his grip. The crowd watched in a silence that bordered on sacred. Men and women who had seen Robert Harrison build an empire, who had witnessed his rise to the top of American society, now watched his literal and figurative descent. Some had tears in their eyes, moved by the raw humanity of the moment. Others felt a mix of satisfaction and pity, seeing justice being served in a way they could never have imagined. The cameras continued to capture every moment, but now with an almost solemn reverence. The flashes seemed less invasive, more like historical documentation than sensationalism. Everyone understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, the voluntary public humiliation of one of the most powerful men in America. When Robert finally reached the floor level, his feet touched the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the hall. He paused for a moment, as if reorienting himself in this new world where he was no longer elevated above others. His hands nervously smoothed the front of his tuxedo, an unconscious gesture revealing how deeply shaken he was. Michael, Emma, and James had stood up when they saw their biological father moving toward them. They positioned themselves side by side, a united human barrier, but also a demonstration of collective strength. Their faces displayed a complex mix of emotions: fear of what he might say, hope that he might finally recognize them as his children, and a deep pain for all the lost years. Robert's path through the hall seemed to stretch infinitely. Each step required conscious effort, as if he were walking through dense water. Guests slightly moved aside as he passed, creating a natural corridor that led directly to the three young people who had changed his life forever. The tension in the hall was palpable, like static electricity before a storm. 500 people collectively held their breath, all aware they were witnessing a moment that would be spoken of for generations. Cameras moved silently to capture better angles, but even the most seasoned journalists seemed more focused on the human story unfolding than on headline opportunities. Robert could feel the weight of all those eyes, but for the first time that night, he did not care about the crowd's opinion. His attention was completely focused on the three young people in front of him, young people who carried his genes, who had inherited his eyes, who had grown up without a father because of his choices. When he finally stopped a few feet from Michael, Emma, and James, the silence in the hall became absolute. Not even the sound of breathing was audible. It was as if the whole world had paused to allow this moment to happen without interference. Robert's eyes, which had been described in business magazines as piercing and intimidating, were now moist with unshed tears. It was a sight that no one in the hall had witnessed before. The most powerful man they knew, vulnerable and broken, grappling with emotions he had suppressed for decades. His hands trembled at his sides, and he clenched them into fists in an attempt to control the shaking. His breathing was irregular, and he swallowed hard, as if his words were stuck in his throat. It was the struggle of a man who had spent his entire life in control, now confronting a situation where control was impossible. Michael, Emma, and James remained perfectly still, as if any movement could break the spell of the moment. Their eyes, the same blue eyes that had revealed the truth, were fixed on Robert's face, searching for signs of recognition, regret, or any indication that he finally saw them as his children. Robert opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words emerged. He closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength from somewhere deep within himself. When he opened them again, a single tear had escaped and was slowly rolling down his cheek, a tear that was captured by dozens of cameras and would become one of the most iconic images of the night. There, in the grand ballroom of the city's most luxurious hotel, under the crystal lights and before the elite of American society, Robert Harrison faced his three children face to face for the first time in their lives, carrying the weight of decades of abandonment and the scientific truth that had destroyed all his denials. For long moments, Robert remained still, his mouth opening and closing as if the words were wild creatures he could not capture. His eyes scanned the faces of the three young people before him, as if he were seeing them for the first time, not as intruders who had invaded his perfect life, but as human beings carrying part of his soul. The heavy silence was broken when Emma, the young woman whose eyes mirrored his own, stepped forward. Her movements were graceful yet determined, like someone who had made an important decision. She slightly lifted her chin, an expression Robert recognized as his own way of showing courage in the face of adversity. "We didn't come here for your money," Emma said, her voice soft but laden with a firmness that echoed through the silent hall. Each word was pronounced with crystal clarity, as if she had rehearsed this moment in her dreams for years. "We don't want anything material from you." The words hit Robert like a lightning bolt. He had spent decades assuming that every human approach was motivated by financial gain, that every relationship was a disguised transaction. But here was his daughter, saying exactly the opposite of what he had expected to hear. Michael, sensing the impact of Emma's words, took half a step closer, his hands slightly extended as if offering truth as a gift. His voice, when it emerged, carried the same deep quality as Robert's, but tempered with a pain that only an abandoned son could understand. "We just wanted you to know that we exist," Michael said, each word heavy with years of unfulfilled longing. "That our mother existed, that she loved you." The mention of Caroline struck Robert like a physical blow. He could feel her there, in the space between him and his children, as if her ghost were finally finding peace. His hands trembled more intensely, and he pressed them against his thighs to try to control the shaking. James, the youngest but clearly the most emotional of the three, could not hold back the tears that had been welling in his eyes. They rolled freely down his cheeks as he spoke, his voice broken with emotion, yet still clear enough for everyone in the hall to hear. "All we ever wanted was a father who recognized us," James said, his voice trembling with the raw vulnerability of someone exposing their soul. "That's all." James's words echoed through the hall like a funeral bell, marking the death of Robert's assumptions about what his children wanted from him. It was not inheritance or access to his empire. It was love, recognition, the fundamental validation that they mattered to someone who had given them life. Robert felt something breaking inside his chest, as if a dam he had built over decades was finally giving way. His eyes, now completely misty, moved from face to face, and for the first time, he truly saw his children. In Emma, he saw not only his own eyes but the tilt of her head when she was focused, the same gesture he made during important meetings. In Michael, he recognized the line of his jaw, the same determination he had inherited from his own father. In James, he saw the vulnerability he had learned to hide, but which still existed somewhere deep within him. Robert began, his voice choked in a way that no one in the hall had ever heard before. He paused, swallowing hard, struggling to find the right words for a moment that had no instruction manual. "I spent my whole life accumulating power, wealth, prestige." His voice faltered for a moment, and he closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength from somewhere he had forgotten existed. When he opened them again, there was a clarity there that transcended the pain. "And only now do I realize that I lost what really matters." The words came out like a confession, each syllable laden with the weight of regret and late realization. Robert could feel the eyes of the entire crowd upon him, but for the first time that night, he did not care about public opinion. His attention was completely focused on the three young people before him, young people who had sacrificed their public dignity to have a moment of honesty with him. The crowd in the hall remained in reverent silence, many with tears in their own eyes. It was clear they were witnessing something deeply personal and transformative. Cameras continued to capture every moment, but now with an almost sacred solemnity. Robert looked at each of his children again, seeing not only the physical resemblance but recognizing qualities he had lost in his pursuit of success. James's vulnerability, Emma's courage, Michael's determination, they were parts of himself he had buried under layers of ambition and fear. Slowly, as if rediscovering a movement he had long forgotten, Robert extended his arms. It was not the confident gesture of a man used to commanding, but the hesitant offer of someone who had discovered he had built his entire life on a false foundation. His arms opened like tired wings, offering the embrace his children had longed for all their lives. It was a vulnerable position, one that left his heart completely exposed, but for the first time in decades, Robert Harrison was willing to be vulnerable. The gesture hung in the air between him and his children, a bridge offered across the chasm of lost years. His eyes, now shining with unshed tears, silently pleaded for a chance to start anew, to be the father he had never been but perhaps still could become. The entire hall seemed suspended in time, waiting to see if his children would accept the offer of reconciliation, if the embrace Robert offered could somehow make up for 2 decades of absence, if love could truly conquer lost time. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the three young people stood still, as if processing the reality of what was happening. Their eyes quickly met each other, a silent communication passing between siblings who had shared this journey together. Then, as if a dam had burst, they moved. James was the first, his young legs propelling him through the small space that separated him from his father. Emma immediately followed, her steps determined yet graceful. Michael, always the most cautious, hesitated for just a fraction of a second before joining his siblings. And then it happened, the moment that would define their lives forever. The three young people collided with Robert simultaneously, their bodies pressing against his in an embrace that transcended words. Robert wrapped his arms around them, pulling them closer, as if trying to reclaim 20 years of lost hugs in a single moment. The embrace was intense, almost desperate in its need. Robert could feel the warmth of his children against his chest, could feel their hearts beating through their clothes. It was a sensation he had never experienced before, not just the physical contact, but the deep emotional connection that came with it. Tears began to flow freely from all 4 of them. Robert, who had cried perhaps a dozen times in his adult life, was now sobbing without restraint. His shoulders shook with the force of his emotion, decades of repressed tears finally finding release. Emma had her face pressed against his chest, her tears staining the expensive fabric of his tuxedo. Michael had wrapped his arms around both his father and his siblings, creating a protective circle. James, the youngest, was sobbing openly, his entire body shaking with years of pent-up longing finally being released. The audience in the hall was completely silent, but it was not the empty silence of the beginning of the night. It was the reverent silence of people witnessing something sacred. Many had tears streaming down their faces, touched by the raw humanity of the moment. Hard-nosed executives who had built fortunes in ruthless business found themselves wiping their eyes with linen handkerchiefs. Robert could feel the texture of his children's hair beneath his hands, could feel how Emma had the same silky hair that Caroline had had, how Michael had the same strong bone structure he recognized in photos of his own youth. These were details he would never have noticed from a distance, but now they became precious through touch. "Forgive me," Robert whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion, the words emerging like a prayer. "Forgive this father who came too late." The words were directed at his children, but also to the universe, to Caroline, to all the lost years that could not be reclaimed. It was a plea from the depths of his soul, the apology he had carried unknowingly for 2 decades. Emma slightly lifted her head, her tears creating shining trails on her cheeks. When she spoke, her voice was choked, but there was a strength in it that reminded Robert of his own mother. "You are here now," she said between sobs, each word laden with forgiveness and hope. "That's what matters." Her words were simple, but they carried a wisdom that Robert had taken decades to learn. It was not about the past that could not be changed, but about the present that could still be lived, about the future that could still be built together. Robert felt something solidifying within him, a clarity that had been absent for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to be certain about what truly mattered. Slowly, he lifted his head, his eyes scanning the silent crowd that still watched them. When he spoke, his voice was strong, clearer and more powerful than it had been all night. But now it carried a different authority, not the authority of power or wealth, but the authority of truth discovered. "Today I learned that it doesn't matter how many billions you have, how many boards you preside over," Robert declared, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "If you don't have love, you have nothing." He paused, looking at each of his children, seeing in them not just shared DNA, but a future of possibilities he had never imagined. "These are my children," he continued, his voice growing in power and conviction. "And I love them." The declaration echoed through the hall like thunder, reverberating off the golden walls and in the hearts of everyone present. For a moment, silence remained, as if no one dared to break the sanctity of the moment. Then, like a rising wave, applause began. It was not the polite applause of high society, but something deeper, more genuine. People rose from their seats, their hands coming together in a standing ovation that seemed to come from their souls. Many were still crying, but now they were tears of joy, witnessing redemption in real time. The sound of applause enveloped the small family at the center of the hall, but Robert barely noticed them. His attention was completely focused on his children, memorizing them, absorbing every detail he had lost for so long. After several minutes, when the applause finally began to subside, Robert made a decision that surprised even himself. Without a word, he began to move toward the exit of the hall, his arms still around his children. "Let's go," he said softly, his voice meant only for them. "Let's get out of here." And so, as the crowd continued to applaud, Robert Harrison, the man who once thought he had it all, walked toward the exit, flanked by his 3 children. Their hands were intertwined, Emma's hand in his left, Michael's in his right, with James walking close to Emma's side. It was an image that would be captured by dozens of cameras, but would be remembered not for the photos, but for the truth it represented. Here was a man who had built an empire, but was discovering that his greatest achievement was walking beside him. Each step toward the exit was symbolic, taking them away from the artificial world of power and privilege and towards something more real, more precious. Robert could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze, but for the first time that night, he didn't care about their opinions. When they reached the double doors of the hall, Robert paused for a moment, looking back at the life he had built. He saw faces he had known for decades, business partners, rivals, social acquaintances. But now, they seemed part of a different world, a world he had inhabited but had never truly lived. He turned back to his children, seeing in them not just his past, but his future. There was so much to learn about them, so much lost time to try to reclaim, so many conversations to have, so many memories to create. "Are you ready?" he asked softly, his voice laden with a mix of nervousness and anticipation. The three young people nodded, their faces shining with dry tears and hopeful smiles. And together, as a family for the first time, they exited the grand ballroom, passing through the doors and into the night that awaited them. The last image the guests in the hall would see was of the four of them walking together down the elegant hotel corridor, their silhouettes growing smaller in the distance, but their hands still intertwined. It was a family finally reunited, leaving behind years of separation and walking toward a future filled with possibilities of love, forgiveness, and reconnection. Robert Harrison had learned, at 52, that true wealth was not measured in dollars or properties, but in the love shared and the hands held. And as they disappeared into the night, it was clear that he had finally discovered what truly mattered.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to keep watching.